She didn't cry when she signed the divorce papers. She just looked at the pen like it meant nothing at all. The courtroom in downtown Chicago felt colder than usual that morning, not because of the weather outside, but because of the silence Emily Carter carried with her as she sat across from Daniel Whitmore. He expected resistance, questions, maybe even a breakdown he could later remember as proof he had been right to leave her behind. But instead, there was only stillness. The judge spoke, papers were placed, and when the final document slid toward her, Emily didn't hesitate. One signature. No trembling hands. No tearful glance back. Just ink meeting paper like she had already said goodbye long before she arrived. Daniel leaned back slightly, almost relieved, almost amused, as if watching something end that had long stopped mattering to him. Around them, the room resumed its rhythm. Chairs shifting, soft footsteps, distant murmurs. But Emily remained unchanged, her expression unreadable, her presence quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. As she stood to leave, someone in the room whispered that she should at least look broken, but she didn't. She simply adjusted her coat, turned toward the exit, and walked out without once looking back. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace. Yellow taxis, morning coffee crowds, the hum of Chicago life. But Emily paused only for a moment on the courthouse steps, letting the wind brush past her face like a reminder that endings were not always loud. Daniel would later tell himself she had nothing left to say. That silence was surrender. But what he didn't see in that moment was how final her quiet truly was. Because some decisions are not made in courtrooms. They are made long before, in the spaces where no one is watching. And what he thought was the end of her story was only the beginning of something he would not understand until much later, when a private jet would descend over Manhattan and the world would finally realize that silence was never emptiness, but preparation. After the courtroom doors closed, Emily Carter did not go home immediately. She walked through downtown Chicago as if the city itself had become unfamiliar, her footsteps blending into the morning rush of strangers who had no idea they had just passed a woman whose life had officially been rewritten on paper. The wind along the river carried a sharp edge that day, brushing against her coat as she stood near the bridge for a long moment. Watching reflections of glass buildings fracture across the water like broken memories she refused to revisit. Somewhere behind her, the world of Daniel Whitmore continued as usual, but for Emily, nothing about that world belonged to her anymore. Hours later, she sat alone in a small cafe tucked between two office buildings, untouched coffee growing colder in front of her as she stared at nothing in particular, as if listening to thoughts she no longer allowed to become words. It was there, in that quiet space, that the first shift happened, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like the turning of a page no one else noticed. A simple notification lit up her phone, an encrypted message with no name attached, only a location and a time, and instead of hesitation, there was recognition, as if she had been expecting it longer than she admitted to herself. The address led far beyond Chicago, beyond the life she had just exited, toward a world she had once been near but never truly part of, a world defined not by comfort, but by precision, influence, and silence that carried weight. That evening, she packed nothing that would tie her to the past, no sentimental objects, no unnecessary reminders, only what was required, moving through her apartment with a calmness that felt almost unfamiliar even to herself. There was no anger in her movements, no regret in the way she closed drawers or folded fabric, only certainty building in layers too quiet for anyone else to hear. When she finally stepped outside again, the sky had shifted into the deep blue of late evening, city lights beginning to blur into a continuous glow, and for the first time since the courthouse, she looked forward instead of back. Somewhere across the country, Daniel Whitmore was beginning to believe he had won something permanent, but in reality, he had only misunderstood the nature of her silence, because what he called an ending was, for Emily Carter, the exact moment everything began to change. The message arrived before midnight, when Chicago had already fallen into a quiet that felt heavier than daylight. But Emily Carter did not treat it like a coincidence. She read the encrypted location once, then a second time, as if repetition could reveal hesitation that was not there. There was none. The address pointed far beyond anything familiar, a private aviation terminal outside the city where silence was not accidental but designed, and that alone told her everything she needed to know. By the time she arrived, the sky over Illinois had deepened into a dark gradient of blue and black, the kind of sky that made city lights look smaller than they were. A vehicle waited for her without markings, without questions, as if her arrival had already been accounted for long before she stepped outside her apartment. No one spoke during the drive. Even the engine felt muted, as though sound itself had been negotiated into submission. At the terminal, she did not look around. She did not need to. Everything here carried the same controlled stillness she had begun to recognize in the message. When the aircraft came into view, it was not introduced with noise or attention, only presence, resting on the runway like something that did not belong to public understanding. A man stood near the base of the stairs waiting for her. Alexander Reed did not introduce himself immediately. He simply observed her as if confirming a decision already made somewhere far above conversation. His expression carried no urgency, only certainty, as if time did not pressure him the way it pressed everyone else. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and without unnecessary words. He said he had expected her earlier, not as a complaint, but as a fact. Emily did not respond with surprise. She had learned by then that surprise was often a reaction reserved for people still tied to old versions of their lives. Instead, she met his gaze briefly, then looked toward the aircraft as if understanding that what waited beyond those steps was not travel but transition. Daniel Whitmore, at that same hour, was somewhere across the country believing in the stability of what he thought he had secured, unaware that distance was no longer a barrier between past and present. Emily placed one hand on the railing and began to ascend the steps without pause, each movement steady, unhurried, as though she had been walking toward this moment long before the message ever arrived. Behind her, Alexander Reed followed at a controlled distance, not leading, not chasing, simply aligned with a direction that no longer required explanation. As the door of the aircraft opened, the interior revealed a space defined by quiet precision, not luxury for display, but structure for those who understood control differently. Emily stepped inside without looking back even once, and in that absence of hesitation something final settled into place, not as an ending, but as confirmation that the life Daniel Whitmore believed he had concluded had never belonged to him in the first place. And somewhere far below, the world she had left continued to move forward without realizing it had already been rewritten. The aircraft began its ascent over the outskirts of Chicago with a smoothness that made the city below feel distant almost immediately, as if it had already been placed into another life Emily Carter would no longer return to. Inside the cabin, the lighting was soft but deliberate, designed not for display but for focus, and the silence carried a weight that felt intentional rather than empty. Emily sat by the window, watching the ground fall away in quiet layers of light, highways turning into thin glowing threads, buildings shrinking into abstract geometry, until the entire world she had just left became something small enough to ignore. Alexander Reed sat across from her without attempting conversation, as if understanding that words were unnecessary at this stage, his presence steady and controlled, the kind of calm that did not invite interpretation. He simply placed a thin folder on the table between them, sliding it forward without emphasis. Emily did not open it immediately. She studied it first, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that what it contained would not be casual information. When she finally opened it, there were no dramatic revelations written in exaggeration, only structured facts, names, financial pathways, and connections that stretched far beyond what most people ever encountered in a lifetime. Somewhere within those pages was a quiet explanation of why her name had not disappeared after the divorce, why certain doors had already begun closing behind her ex-husband without him realizing it, and why her silence had never been as empty as it appeared. Across the country, Daniel Whitmore was beginning to notice small inconsistencies in his world, meetings that shifted without explanation, contacts that responded differently than before, conversations that ended too quickly. None of it yet formed a clear picture, but it created a feeling he could not name, a subtle discomfort that something once stable was no longer entirely under his control. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to timing, coincidence, or business fluctuations, unaware that distance was not protecting him from consequence, but simply delaying recognition. Back on the aircraft, Emily closed the folder after reading it once, then looked at Alexander Reed with a calm expression that carried no visible reaction. He did not ask what she thought. He did not need to. Instead, he said only that everything she had left behind would continue to believe it had control over its own direction until the moment it no longer did. The aircraft leveled above the clouds, where the sky stretched into an uninterrupted field of pale light. And for the first time since the courthouse, Emily felt not like someone escaping a life, but like someone stepping fully into one that had been prepared long before she chose to recognize it. Below them, cities continued to move, contracts continued to be signed, and a man named Daniel Whitmore continued to believe he had ended something important, not realizing that the structure he once depended on was already being quietly rearranged beyond his reach. The aircraft crossed into open sky, where daylight no longer felt tied to any specific city, and Emily Carter remained seated by the window, as if she were no longer measuring time in the same way she had before. Below, the United States stretched into a vast pattern of light and shadow, highways connecting states like threads that no longer carried emotional weight for her. Inside the cabin, the silence continued, but it had evolved into something more structured, almost like a language that only a few people were allowed to understand. Alexander Reed remained across from her, reviewing documents on a tablet with the same calm precision he had shown since the moment she boarded, never rushing, never seeking confirmation, as if everything unfolding was already accounted for in advance. Emily's attention eventually returned to the folder she had closed earlier, not because she needed to re-examine it, but because she was beginning to understand that its contents were not meant to surprise her, only to confirm what she had already been stepping toward long before the divorce. Each name and connection represented a layer of distance being constructed between her past and the life that now quietly expanded in front of her. There was no celebration in that realization, only clarity, the kind that removes uncertainty rather than replaces it with emotion. At the same time, across the country, Daniel Whitmore stood in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown Chicago, unaware that the rhythm of his day had begun to subtly shift in ways he could not yet articulate. A meeting that was expected to close smoothly had been delayed without explanation. A key contact had suddenly become non-committal, and a scheduled acquisition review had been postponed without clear reasoning. None of these moments appeared significant on their own, but together they created a pattern that disrupted his sense of control, a pattern he dismissed as coincidence because he had no reason yet to believe otherwise. He told himself that business always fluctuated, that timing was unpredictable, and that nothing had changed beyond normal variation. But beneath that logic was a quiet discomfort he did not yet have language for. Back on the aircraft, Emily finally looked away from the window and turned slightly toward Alexander Reed, asking only one question in a calm voice about how far the changes extended. He did not answer immediately with detail, only with perspective, explaining that influence did not move in sudden waves, but in gradual realignments that most people only noticed when it was already too late to respond. His tone carried no threat, only fact, as if describing weather patterns rather than human systems. Emily absorbed this without visible reaction, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, but something within her understanding settled into place with greater definition. She was not being introduced to power as something new, but rather being shown the shape of a structure that had always existed beyond her previous awareness. The aircraft continued forward above the cloud layer, where sunlight softened into an even expanse of white and gold, and for the first time, Emily did not feel connected to what she had left behind in any lingering way. Daniel Whitmore, still believing himself to be positioned firmly within control of his environment, would have dismissed all of this as unrelated fragments of routine disruption, not realizing that the distance between certainty and collapse is often measured not in events, but in recognition, and recognition, in his case, had not yet begun. By the time the aircraft began its gradual descent toward the private terminal outside New York, Emily Carter no longer felt like she was crossing a distance between two cities, but rather moving through layers of a life that had already been reorganized without public awareness. The sky outside the window had shifted into a pale gradient, soft light spreading across the horizon like a quiet confirmation that something irreversible had already taken place. Inside the cabin, there was no announcement of arrival, no visible urgency, only the controlled stillness of people who understood that what awaited them on the ground was not transition, but continuation. Emily sat with her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze steady, not searching for familiarity below, because nothing she saw would have matched what she had left behind. Alexander Reed remained composed beside her, his attention briefly moving from the tablet to the approaching runway, as if verifying a sequence that had already been executed elsewhere. He finally spoke only to confirm that the next phase would not resemble anything she had experienced before, not in pace, not in visibility, and not in consequence. Emily did not ask for clarification, because by now she understood that clarity was not offered in advance within this world. It was revealed through exposure. As the aircraft touched down smoothly, the sensation was less of arrival and more of alignment, as if the world below had already adjusted itself to accommodate her presence before she stepped into it. Outside the terminal, there were no public announcements, no attention drawn to movement, only vehicles positioned with precise timing and personnel who did not speak more than necessary. Emily exited the aircraft without hesitation, her steps measured but unforced, moving through the environment with the same calm she had maintained since the courthouse, though now it carried a different weight, one shaped by distance rather than absence. The drive from the terminal led through roads that gradually shifted from industrial outskirts into structured urban corridors, each transition subtle but intentional, as if the city itself was layered in degrees of access. Alexander Reed did not explain the destination in detail, and Emily did not request it, because both of them understood that understanding would come through observation rather than description. Across the country, Daniel Whitmore was now fully immersed in a series of developments he still could not connect into a single cause. Meetings that no longer aligned with expectation, delayed responses from institutions that had once been predictable, and subtle changes in financial positioning that he interpreted as temporary instability rather than structural shift. He reassured himself that influence in his world was stable, that relationships between entities did not change without notice, and that what he was experiencing was simply the natural rhythm of business cycles. Yet beneath that reasoning was a growing inconsistency he chose not to name, a space where certainty used to exist but now felt slightly displaced. Back in New York, Emily's vehicle came to a stop outside a building that did not display prominence through exterior design, but through presence that could only be recognized by those who understood its role. She stepped out, looked up once, and continued forward without pause. Alexander Reed followed at a measured distance, not guiding her, but confirming alignment with her movement. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, structured, and deliberately unremarkable in appearance, yet every detail carried intention. As Emily walked deeper into the space, she began to notice the absence of noise that usually accompanied power, replaced instead by precision and restraint. It was here, in this controlled environment, that she was not introduced as someone arriving, but acknowledged as someone expected. And somewhere far away, Daniel Whitmore continued to believe that distance protected him from consequence, unaware that what he dismissed as fluctuation was already the early stage of a redefinition he had no visibility into, because by the time change becomes visible to those outside its origin, it has already completed its most important work. Inside the building in New York, Emily Carter moved through corridors that did not rely on decoration to communicate importance, but instead relied on structure, silence, and the absence of unnecessary attention. Every step she took deeper into the space felt less like entering a location and more like entering a system that had already accounted for her arrival. Alexander Reed remained slightly behind her, not guiding, not interrupting, only observing as though confirming that every expected point of transition was being met exactly as designed. There were no formal introductions from staff in the traditional sense, only brief acknowledgments that carried meaning without requiring explanation. Emily noticed this immediately, not as something strange, but as something consistent with everything she had experienced since leaving Chicago, as if this environment operated on a principle where recognition replaced conversation. She was led into a quiet room with wide glass panels overlooking the city skyline, where the movement of traffic below appeared distant and controlled, like patterns viewed from above rather than lived within. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she observed the space, noting how stillness here did not feel empty but intentional, as though even silence had been designed with purpose. Alexander finally spoke, explaining that what she was entering was not a position in the traditional sense, but a shift in visibility, where influence was no longer something observed from the outside, but something participated in from within. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present, absorbing not only his words but the implication behind them. Meanwhile, across the country, Daniel Whitmore attended a formal gathering in Chicago where he was expected to present stability and continuity in his professional standing. The environment around him remained polished and familiar, filled with conversations that reflected confidence and routine assurance. Yet Daniel found himself distracted by small inconsistencies that had begun accumulating over the past several days. Certain introductions carried subtle hesitation, certain responses lacked their previous certainty, and certain names that once opened doors now required additional validation. He dismissed these moments publicly with composed professionalism, but internally they formed a pattern he could not fully stabilize through logic alone. Back in New York, Emily was shown documentation that outlined structures of decision-making and strategic alignment across multiple sectors, not as something she was being asked to approve immediately, but as something she was being gradually positioned to understand. There was no pressure in the presentation, only clarity, as if time itself had been adjusted to allow comprehension rather than reaction. She finally asked one question about scope, not from uncertainty, but from necessity of precision, and Alexander responded by stating that scope was not fixed, but responsive to those who understood how to engage it without disruption. That answer did not surprise her. Instead, it confirmed something she had already begun to recognize since the aircraft, that control in this environment was not demonstrated through force, but through quiet alignment of systems that already existed. As the conversation continued, Emily remained composed, her presence steady, not as someone being introduced to power, but as someone being allowed to recognize the structure she had unknowingly approached long before her divorce was finalized. And far away, Daniel Whitmore continued to interpret the shifting signals around him as temporary instability, unaware that what he was experiencing was not disruption, but gradual exclusion from a framework he once believed he understood, because by the time a system stops responding to a person, it rarely announces the change directly. It simply continues without them. The moment Daniel Whitmore stepped into the boardroom in Chicago, the atmosphere felt unchanged on the surface, yet subtly different in ways he could not immediately quantify. The glass walls still reflected confidence. The table still carried the polished order of a familiar environment, and the faces around him still maintained professional composure. Yet there were slight hesitations in the way certain executives acknowledged him, small pauses that did not belong in conversations that had always been seamless before. He noticed it first in a delayed response to a proposal he had expected to pass without discussion, then in a revised agenda that removed a previously confirmed priority item without explanation. Daniel maintained his expression, controlled and steady, continuing through the meeting as though nothing had shifted, but internally, he registered each inconsistency with growing attention. Across the country in New York, Emily Carter stood near the glass wall of the upper-level office space, looking out over a skyline that stretched far beyond immediate comprehension. Alexander rejoined her after a brief exchange with staff, his presence calm and unassuming, yet clearly connected to the structure of decisions unfolding beyond what she could directly see. He informed her that what Daniel Whitmore was currently experiencing was not an isolated event, but part of a broader adjustment in alignment that had begun before Emily ever stepped onto the aircraft. Emily listened carefully, not reacting with surprise, but with a quiet understanding forming in layers rather than moments. She asked only whether the process required her involvement at this stage, and Alexander responded that involvement was no longer about action, but about presence within a system that had already begun responding to her existence. Meanwhile, Daniel left the boardroom with a composed demeanor, exchanging polite acknowledgments with colleagues, yet feeling an increasing disconnect between what he expected and what was actually unfolding around him. In the hallway outside, he paused briefly, reviewing messages on his phone that reflected similar patterns of delay and recalibration across multiple areas of his professional network. He attributed it to timing, to coincidence, to temporary inefficiency, but none of those explanations fully stabilized the unease building beneath his reasoning. In New York, Emily was guided through a final review of operational frameworks that defined how influence was distributed across interconnected sectors, not as a transfer of ownership, but as a recognition of positioning. There was no ceremony involved, no announcement, only structured understanding being gradually revealed as she continued to observe and absorb without resistance. Alexander explained that the most significant shifts were rarely visible at the moment they occurred, because systems of influence adjusted quietly before acknowledgment ever followed. Emily remained still as she processed this, recognizing that what she had once perceived as distance from this world had actually been proximity without awareness. Daniel, returning to his office overlooking Chicago, attempted to restore normalcy by focusing on immediate tasks, yet found that certain confirmations no longer arrived with the certainty he was accustomed to. Each attempt to re-establish predictability resulted in subtle delays, as though the system he relied on was no longer responding with the same immediacy. He did not yet understand the origin of this change, only that something foundational in his environment had begun operating beyond his direct reach. And far above the city, Emily Carter stood within a space where silence itself felt structured, realizing without urgency that her former life had not been interrupted or taken away, but quietly repositioned into something she was only now beginning to see in full scale. The evening in New York had already settled into a calm, reflective glow when Emily Carter stood once again near the glass walls of the upper-level office space, looking out at a skyline that now felt less like a view and more like a map of unfolding consequence. There was no sense of urgency around her, only the quiet precision of a moment that had reached its intended completion. Alexander Reed approached without announcement, his presence aligning naturally with the stillness of the room, as if he had always been part of the structure rather than an addition to it. He informed her that the final adjustments in alignment across multiple sectors had now reached confirmation, and that the remaining responses from Chicago had transitioned fully into reactive mode rather than directive control. Emily did not ask for elaboration, because she no longer needed translation for what she was beginning to understand intuitively. Instead, she asked a single question about whether what had been set in motion required further direction from her, and Alexander replied that direction was no longer external, but internal to the position she now occupied within the system. Across the country, Daniel Whitmore sat in his office long after most of his staff had left, the city lights of Chicago stretching beyond his window in patterns that once represented stability but now felt slightly unfamiliar. He reviewed documents again and again, searching for clarity in transactions that no longer followed the certainty he had previously relied on. Each explanation he constructed for himself felt less complete than the last, as if the foundation of his assumptions had developed gaps he could not fully identify. He reached out to contacts who had once responded immediately, only to find delayed answers or redirected conversations that subtly shifted focus away from him. He told himself it was temporary, a cycle, a fluctuation within normal business rhythm, but the repetition of inconsistency began to challenge even his internal confidence. In New York, Emily remained composed, her attention shifting briefly from the skyline back into the room where structured silence defined every interaction. Alexander explained that what Daniel was experiencing was not a correction aimed at confrontation, but a natural outcome of systems adjusting to a redefined center of influence. Emily listened without interruption, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone observing the final stages of a process she had unknowingly initiated through her departure and silence. There was no emotion attached to the realization, only recognition that distance had never been absence, and absence had never meant irrelevance. Meanwhile, Daniel closed his laptop after another unanswered inquiry, leaning back in his chair as he attempted to reconstruct a narrative that would preserve his sense of control. But the narrative no longer aligned with outcomes, and that misalignment was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He looked out over the city once more, noticing how familiar lights no longer carried the same reassurance they once did. In New York, Emily finally turned away from the glass, walking slowly toward the center of the room where Alexander stood waiting in quiet acknowledgment. Nothing about her expression suggested victory or loss, because neither concept felt relevant within the structure she was now entering. Alexander simply stated that what had changed was not her position relative to her past, but the irreversibility of her movement beyond it. Emily nodded once, not in agreement or disagreement, but in understanding that required no further articulation. And somewhere far away, Daniel Whitmore continued to search for the source of change within a world that had already moved beyond his point of reference, unaware that the silence he once dismissed had already completed its work, leaving him in a reality that no longer centered around him.